Hello, and welcome to my latest video on the magnificent world of Soulsborne, a world of demons, knights, beasts, samurai, demigods, and much more. A world of castles, rancid underground settlements, dark twisted cities, holy temples, mystical academies of magic. Need I go on? The thrust of this intro is to illustrate how delightfully fantastical and fantastic these games are, from Demon Souls to the Dark Souls trilogy to Bloodborne to Sekiro, all the way to the glorious golden Elden Ring. Oh, Elden Ring. I love every one of these games, and over the past decade or so I've indulged in repeated playthroughs of every one of them to the point where I know them very well. The level layouts, the enemy placements, the stats, mechanics and systems, and especially the bosses. As such, I recently put out a couple of videos where I went through my personal picks for the best and worst bosses from each game, and then the best and worst levels, and I had a lot of fun putting together my selections and then explaining my reasoning, though I admit that some of my picks may have been unconventional, to say the least. The thing is though, I had so much damn fun putting together those videos that a seed was planted in my mind, an idea, a proposition if you will. That being to just go the whole hog and rank and review every Soulsborne boss from worst to best. And folks, that's exactly what I'm going to do. And here we are, and here you are. So a few things to get out of the way before getting stuck in. If an enemy does not have a boss health bar, they ain't in the running for this video. So no Hydra from Dark Souls 1 or Stray Demon from Dark Souls 3 for example. Also, I know Sekiro isn't considered a Soulsborne game by a lot of people, which is fine, I get it, but regardless, I'm including Sekiro's bosses anyway, the more the merrier. And speaking of Sekiro, the only bosses I'll be taking into consideration from that game are the ones which drop memories, like Genichiro, Corrupted Monk, etc. I won't be talking about the mini-boss type enemies, mandatory or otherwise, because there's a hell of a lot of them, many of them are simply variants of other mini-bosses, and there's enough bloody bosses to talk about even without them, trust me. For the exact same reasons, I'll also only be considering the remembrance bosses from Elden Ring, like Godric, Mohg, etc. So no minor dungeon or field bosses for today. And the same goes for Bloodborne's Chalice dungeons. I know there are a few really cool bosses like the Bloodletting Beast and Beast Possessed Soul, but most are simply regular enemies with boss health bars or just more challenging variants of story bosses. Thus, if my calculations are correct, the final boss count from all 7 games comes in at a hefty 162. It would have been 160, but I've chosen to consider Emma the Gentle Blade and Ishin Ashina as separate bosses, same with Radagon and the Elden Beast. As for my actual criteria for placing bosses at particular ranks, and for putting any one demon higher than any other beast or what have you, well, look folks, ultimately it's just based on how much I like and respect that boss. There is nothing objective about this list. I made no effort to make my choices safe and agreeable and conventional, and you might even be shocked and disgusted at some boss placements, and I get it. It's very easy to get heated when you see a boss you love get disrespected by some chump from Scotland of all places, but look folks, if I'm putting together a list of best and worst Soulsborne bosses, I'm putting together my actual picks, not just ones that I think most people will agree with. Well, I think that's just about all the provisions, particulars and specifics being highlighted, and so I see little need in prolonging the intro much more than is necessary. If you find yourself enjoying the video, hey, why not subscribe to the channel? I'd sure appreciate it. And lastly, before I kick off with boss number 162, please allow me to give thanks to my kind patrons for their support. And with all that being said, let's get down to brass tacks, shall we? Look, I know I just gave a whole spiel about my list being unconventional and everything, but as avant-garde as my tastes often range, I still just couldn't bring myself to put anything other than the Bed of Chaos as the all-time worst Soulsborne boss. It sucks that bad. Often when discussing even really crappy bosses, you'll still find some people who go, nah, you know, I actually like that boss. And look, I'm sure even the Bed of Chaos has its enthusiasts, but they are rare. The encounter really is that bad. There's no real fighting involved, the run back is torturous, most of the boss's moves are cheap, either doing excessive damage or being designed to sweep you into a crack in the ground, and even when you manage to destroy its weak points at either side of the arena, you can still get one-shotted inside its core with a last-ditch Chaos Storm. There's also just an inherent lack of satisfaction with enemies like this, where you can't directly attack them. I see this big health bar, and I see this admittedly rather badass looking chaotic, flaming creature, but I can't actually whack it with my great scythe. It's more like the arena itself is the boss, and even when you do finally get inside, turns out it's just some dumb bug. Take that. I'd love to say that my mind had changed somewhat on the Bed of Chaos over the years since I first faced it, but it hasn't. This boss remains a certified stinker. The next boss fight to be mercilessly mocked and shamed is none other than the afflicted grave robber, ancient soldier Varg and Serra the Old Explorer, aka the Gank Squad. See, every Soulsborne game features bosses against NPC type enemies, and they tend not to be highlights of the experience. But even so, usually they're still enjoyable enough to fight, same as when you get invaded by offline phantoms at certain areas. Well, as well regarded as Dark Souls 2 is when it comes to PvP content, I happen to think it has the weakest NPC combat. I hate when a character with some meaningless bland name invades me when traversing through the lost land of Drangleic, because there's almost never any actual lore related to these figures, and the best strategy for victory tends to be stunlock the enemy and then keep them stunlocked. Well, everything I dislike about these sorts of encounters in Dark Souls 2 is present in the Gank Squad boss, and then some. There's 3 of them, they have non-unique armour and weapons. You can easily get stunlocked to death by 1 or 2 of them, especially when you take into consideration the arrows constantly being fired at you by Serra, and a major aspect of the battle involves constant running around the obnoxious arena to regain a favourable position to allow you to pick them off one by one. Also, although it's not entirely fair to take the run back into consideration when assessing the boss itself, I do have to mention the shocker of a run back through the Cave of the Dead, past an absurd number of enemies and these horrible statues which cause petrification build-up, which is an instant death by the way. I really can forgive a lot about a boss fight's mechanics if other elements of it are cool, like its presentation or even associated lore, but the Gank Squad ain't got nothing I like. Ha, Gank Squad? More like no thank squad, as in no thank you, I prefer to fight a different boss. Alright? For the next couple of entries, we're going to go way back to Soulsborne's roots, back to Demon Souls, a game which I like very much, though I'm afraid I don't think's the highlight of many of its bosses, and the boss I'm thinking of here lies at the end of the second level in the Tower of Latria. It's the Man-Eaters. Now, I know there will be a few Demon Souls fans who just recoiled in horror at this choice, but nonetheless, nostalgia for a really great game aside, I detest the Man-Eaters. There's a lot of AI tomfoolery present in Demon Souls, if you'll pardon my language, and this tomfoolery was in no way addressed or fixed in the 2020 remake of the game for PS5, for better or for worse. And as a result, the often odd behaviour of certain enemies and bosses was now highlighted even further by those glorious next-gen graphics, and as far as I'm concerned, no boss in this game is as odd, janky and downright unpleasant as the Man-Eaters. They'll randomly fly off into the night, mid-attack before awkwardly circling back, sometimes being unable to even get onto the damn walkway because they flew in too low, or landing on a pillar to chill there for a few seconds before hopefully jumping back down and rejoining the fight, and sometimes they'll even use attacks mid-flight which were clearly only intended to be used when grounded, which just looks really goofy. The arena itself is one of, if not the single most perilous arena in all of Soulsborne, being a narrow walkway which is very easy to fall off of or be pushed off of, and I can take that. It's rough and tough, but that alone is not a deal breaker. But when you take that unsightly jank into account, and the moments where all you can do is stand there and watch one of them make yet another baffling circuit through the air before returning, it just makes for a crappy boss experience, so much so that I hate fighting these things. And here we have another classic Demon Souls stinker, one which is remarkably similar to the Bed of Chaos in several ways, and which is also considered the worst Demon Souls boss by many. It's the Dragon God. Honestly, if it weren't for the man-eaters, it would also be my least favourite from the game, but for as much as I don't enjoy the Dragon God's shtick, I enjoy the man-eaters even less. The main thrust of the boss is to activate the contraptions at both sides of the arena, each of which depletes a massive portion of its health before getting in close to deliver the coup de grace. The trouble is that if you're a bit too indiscreet in your movements along the narrow, rubble-littered paths of the arena, the Dragon God can easily one-shot you with its fire breath or an enormous fist, and when this happens it can be really, really aggravating. I know that many folks simply didn't quite pick up on the gimmick here upon first entering the arena, that being to look at the colour of the Dragon God's eyes and to only run to the next pillar when it's looking away. But even when you do understand that, the experience just feels kinda clumsy and clunky. Also, there's that bed of chaos thing again of seeing this big monster and just not being able to fight it, with the boss feeling more like an environmental hazard than an actual enemy you're engaging in combat with. The spectacle of the Dragon God is admittedly great, and it certainly is very intimidating when you first see it, but this is never an encounter I look forward to, rather it's just one to grimly soldier through and then on to the next archdemon. For number 158, we're back to Drang Lake, and my boss of choice happens to be one that wasn't even in the game when it first released, instead being added in patch 1.10 as the true final boss, Aldea, Scholar of the First Sin. Now, I'm not a great lover of the Nishandra fight, which was the game's previous final boss, but it wasn't terrible, just underwhelming. Aldea, however, is so bad that I'd honestly have preferred he was never added into the game at all. For most of the encounter, he'll be bathed in flames and thus out of range of melee strikes, not to mention having significantly buffed defence, while hurling fireballs at the player or sending spikes up from the ground from its tree-like appendages. The attacks are limited, repetitive and easily avoided, but the worst thing is that for most of the fight, all you can really do is stand back and try not to get hit before rushing in for the 3 seconds at a time where Aldea is actually vulnerable, and then repeat the cycle until his health bar is fully depleted. I know that Aldea as a character is very important to the story of Dark Souls 2 and that it made sense for them to add him in, and he does appear at several points throughout the player's journey to provide dialogue, but as a boss, I've always found him to be utterly unenjoyable and unengaging. I hope you're prepared for some more Dark Souls 1 bosses now, because I've got 3 in a row for you, starting with the Centipede Demon, coming in at number 157. The Centipede Demon is the boss lying directly before the Bed of Chaos, guarding the entrance to Lost Izalith from the Demon Ruins, arguably 2 of the game's weakest levels. I've always found this boss's design to be overly chaotic. Now, I'm aware of how silly that sounds, by the way, being that it's a demon, literally having been created by chaos itself, but even so, bloody hell, what a mess, and its messy design has an unpleasant effect on the fight itself, because when coupled with the classic Dark Souls camera hijinks, it can be tough to work out what the hell's even going on at times. The worst thing about this fight though is the arena gimmick, because it's full of magma which will burn your wee feet in seconds flat, and thus either you stick to one of the small islands, taking care not to accidentally roll into the magma, or you destroy the Centipede Demon's tail to get the orange charred ring a bit earlier, though have fun frantically equipping it in the heat of battle, and then still taking that continuous, obnoxious chip damage afterwards that will continue on in Lost Izalith. I don't hate this boss or anything, but I'm just really not a fan. Nothing about it feels tight or polished, but rather, it's like one of the devs turned to everyone at a meeting and said, hey, what if we have a boss that's just made out of a bunch of massive centipedes, and also there's magma everywhere, but in Japanese. I imagine the meeting sounded like this.
ねえ、巨大なムカデの群れでできたボスがいて、そこら中に液体の熱いマグマがあるとしたらどうなるでしょうか?
Let's stick with the whole magma theme for number 156, shall we? And with another boss found in the Demon Ruins, one who prevents traversal down to its deeper levels, Ceaseless Discharge. Now, if I was judging the boss purely on scale and spectacle alone, then Ceaseless Discharge would probably rank very highly indeed. The sight of this mighty, scorching titan as you enter its arena really is awesome, especially with it not actually attacking you unless you either attack it or nab the gold-hemmed set. However, unfortunately for it, I am not solely judging the boss on how it looks, because mechanically, well, it ain't great. It doesn't have many attacks at all and they're very slow, but even so, the hitboxes here can be, shall we say, questionable. I'm not suggesting that this is a particularly difficult boss, though if you try to take it on right after beating Quelag when you're still likely to be rather low leveled, then it certainly can pose issues, especially if you're getting one-shotted by its attacks, though it's always fun to just return later on when you're much stronger to destroy its health bar. The boss isn't offensively bad or anything, it's just really not very engaging. You see an animation starting, you brace for impact, hoping the iframes will be kind to you this time, the attack lands, and then you whack its weird tentacle arm thing a few times and repeat. Of course, there is also the strategy of baiting its long range grab for an easy, cheesy alternative kill, which is pretty cool I guess, but all in all, just not a very good boss. Yet another demon from the annals of Dark Souls 1 here I'm afraid, and I'm sure another which will come as no surprise to anyone, the Capra demon. That utterly bothersome goat-headed fiend lurking in Glor Undead Burg and holding on to the key to the depths. The very first time I played Dark Souls 1, I got to the Bell Gargoyles, then straight up gave up, and did not touch the game for another year or two. That's how badly they damaged me. Then, when I did eventually pick it up again, I still had a hard time of course, but fared significantly better, at least until I met the Capra demon. Good lord, I still keenly remember the sheer frustration and outrage I felt upon being flattened, smoked and mauled every time I entered through that fog gate, and I know I wasn't the only one. Nowadays, this fight is nothing to me, because I understand the game's mechanics very well, but on a first playthrough where everything's still new and scary, this fight is hell. The cramped arena, the two dogs thrown in just for the hell of it, the crappy run back. It's no fun, and even the strategy that's recommended for those struggling is pretty clumsy, having to bait the demon up the stairs and have it drop back down so you can land a few hits and then repeat. It's not great. Furthermore, you see the same enemy copy-pasted ad nauseum later on in the demon ruins, which just kind of retroactively cheapens this encounter even more. And here we have our first boss from Sekiro, and in my opinion the worst boss from that entire game, the Headless Apes. Now, despite the array of mixed opinions on the Guardian Ape boss fought earlier in the game, it happens to be one of my all-time favourites, specifically for the awesomeness and creepiness of its second phase, and so you might think I would have similar affection for the Headless Apes boss, but no. The single biggest bollock for this encounter is the inclusion of a second ape, because now whilst you're trying to dodge the Headless Ape's wide arcing swings, thrusts and perilous attacks, you've got another foe delivering wild arm swings and swipes, and to tell you the truth, I hate it. The one saving grace is that the smaller ape really doesn't have all that much health or posture, but even so, this encounter has just never worked for me. It is really challenging, but not in that tight, satisfying way characteristic of most Sekiro bosses, instead feeling overly chaotic and downright unreasonable at times. There are some bosses in this game that I don't super look forward to because of how intimidating they are, like Ishin Sword Saint, but for the Headless Apes, I don't look forward to them because, well, to put it scientifically, I think this fight's shit. For number 153, we must travel back to Demon Souls, I'm afraid, this time to Stonefang Tunnel, to the end of its first level, to the lair of the Armour Spider. This really isn't a super difficult encounter, but at the same time I do tend to die on it at least once on any new playthrough, though my main gripe with the Armour Spider is how tedious and repetitive the fight is. The bosses of Demon Souls are a great deal more simplistic than those found in the later games, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, more complexity doesn't automatically equate to higher quality, but sometimes that limited AI does come into full view and it can really draw you out of the experience and make you feel like you're just contending against a cycle of moves. This is how I feel when fighting the Armour Spider, especially with the attack where it douses the ground in a flammable liquid before setting it alight, forcing you to run to the back of the arena and repeat the cycle of moving forward past the fireballs and webbage, getting some hits in whilst dodging its melee hits, then doing it all over again a few times. And I guess the fact that the boss is entirely stationary also doesn't help with all this. I don't think the Armour Spider is a terrible boss, but nor do I enjoy fighting it at all, and plus its inclusion here in the level has always felt a wee bit random to me. One thing I do really like about Dark Souls 2 is the sheer amount of stuff in it. It has a ton of armour sets, loads of weapons and a damn plethora of bosses, though the upshot is that quite a few of them really aren't very interesting, and a perfect example is the Royal Rat Vanguard, which is barely a boss at all. Down in the Grave of Saints, far below the sunny vistas of Majula, lies a boss Fogwall, and when you enter a Fogwall you expect an exciting boss, be it a knight in shining armour, or a bizarre monster, or God knows what else, but behind this particular fog wall lies a bunch of rats. The fight is just with a bunch of rats, but one of them has a mohawk, and that's about all there is to say really. I guess the extra bit of spice added to the battle is that the rats do a wee bit of petrification build up on attack, but I've never been petrified once during this fight. It's just not very difficult to avoid their attacks. It's not that this boss is unpleasant or anything, it's just that the only things that even qualify it as a boss are the health bar and the fact that it's behind a fog wall and nothing else. Lame. I have very similar feelings towards the Prowling Magus as I do towards the Royal Rat Vanguard. Again, it's just a bunch of regular enemies which pose no real challenge. You just progressively take out more of the congregation whilst avoiding any lightning spears chucked your way, as well as the dark AoE attack. The Prowling Magus itself literally only has 2 attacks of its own, seemingly designed to only slightly inconvenience you as you go about depleting the 2 boss health bars. This really is about as nondescript as a boss can possibly get, and I'll be honest, I've already ran out of things to say about it, so probably best to move on to the next entry. And that next entry is the Folding Screen Monkeys, though it's probably the single most unique boss in this entire list, only really being classed as a boss because of its health bar and the fact that you are rewarded with a memory for defeating it. Honestly, the fight's more of a puzzle than anything else, featuring 4 monkeys who each have their own quirks, which makes them uniquely challenging to capture. Well, mostly challenging. The idea is to use the different features at each corner of the large arena to your advantage to counter the strength of that specific monkey you want to capture and kill, and I guess it's a pretty cool idea and the kind of near puzzle type thing which is very uncharacteristic of FromSoft games, but regardless I don't enjoy this encounter. It's pretty novel the first time you play through the game, but on repeated playthroughs it is just a pain in the arse. When I'm frantically flying through the level, desperately trying to catch some cheeky monkey only for it to evade me once again, I can't help but think, I don't want to be doing this right now. I want to be out in the world delivering plunging death blows and fighting actual bosses, not messing around with all this bloody monkey business. I do appreciate what FromSoft were going for here, and I like that they tried something new, but for me it all gets old very quickly. These things just drive me bananas. I'm sorry. We ain't done with Dark Souls 2 just yet folks, because there are still a few more of its bosses to appear down here in the scorned depths of the list, which brings us to number 149, the Skeleton Lords. Again, we've got another group fight with a crap ton of enemies, but the skeletons instead of rats. Although the 3 Skeleton Lords themselves are unique enemies, they pretty much just behave like regular enemies to the extent that they can even be backstabbed. Defeating one will then summon a load of regular skeletons, which also have to be taken down to gradually lower the boss health bar, which acts as a shared health pool for all enemies in the fight. They seem to have made this fight significantly more hectic in the Scholar of the First Sin version of the game, because I don't remember there being this many skeletons in the battle the one time in the vanilla version, and I guess that's kinda cool, but even so, the boss just boils down to a fight against a bunch of skeletons, and it really ain't that interesting. Also, I just find the concept of it to be kinda lame. That there are just these 3 so-called Skeleton Lords sitting in this random cave under a waterfall. It all just feels a bit arbitrary, tacked on, and ultimately uninteresting. Well, we had one rat-based boss already with the Royal Rat Vanguard, but here we have yet another, introducing the Royal Rat Authority, located in the doors of Pharos. The name of the boss is kinda weird to be honest, because that's clearly a coyote or a dog or something, a big old woof woof, not a rat. So I'll say what everyone already knows about this mangy mutt and its obnoxious pint-sized helpers. This fight is an awful mess in every way. Its attacks have really awkward timings and hitboxes. The smaller dogs can be difficult to hit because of their size, and whilst it can be a challenging fight, the challenge comes from how goofy and clunky it all feels. There's nothing tight about this encounter, and for all the criticism you can level at it, Dark Souls 2 really does have some tight boss encounters. The thing that kept me from placing the Royal Rat Authority just a bit lower on this list was its visual design, because to be honest, I do really like how disgusting it looks. It even has an attack where it straight up vomits on the ground, and it's really gross, but also kinda sick. Pun intended. Finally, we have our first Dark Souls 3 entry in the list, and while there are a couple more from the game coming soon, I do rate the game's bosses very highly. I'm a massive fan of Dark Souls 3, and I think it has some of the best bosses in all of Soulsborne, but I'm afraid Half-Light simply does not make the cut. I guess it shares similarities with the Gank Squad being an NPC based fight with Half-Light, Spear of the Church, who is accompanied by several painted guardian type enemies, though there is also a PvP element to the fight of course, just like with the old monk from Demon's Souls and the Looking Glass Knight from Dark Souls 2. Although the PvP aspect might put Half-Light a fair bit higher on the list for some, it doesn't for me. I have little to no interest in PvP, and I almost always play these games offline, and so whenever I go up against Half-Light, I just fight the regular version. Nonetheless, I don't really think this is a bad encounter, it's just not that great, although Half-Light himself can be very annoying to fight with his various special attacks. The NPC type fights can get particularly difficult in Dark Souls 3, and Half-Light is no exception. This next entry happens to be similar in nature to Half-Light, again featuring a PvP aspect where you could end up facing off with an actual player, with Demon's Souls being the first Soulsborne game to implement this interesting and creative feature, and that's the only reason why I have placed the old monk just ahead of Half-Light. As I've said, I'm not a PvP guy, and so when I fight bosses like this, I'm fighting the basic offline versions, and in the case of the old monk, there's nothing particularly impressive or interesting about it, other than his extravagant choice of headwear, I suppose. It just plays out like a regular encounter with a phantom armed with claws, except with a homing soul mass type spell which automatically triggers from time to time, and there's really nothing else that's special or distinctive about this boss. The lore significance of the demonic yellow turban and the story of the old monk and how badly he fucked everything up in Latria is all awesome, but even so, all that external flavour doesn't really do much to alter the actual feel of this fight. At number 145, we have the boss found at the top of the Dragon Shrine, the Ancient Dragon. Something kinda unique about this boss is that you can actually talk to it beforehand, and in fact, you need the Ashen Mist Heart it gives you to even finish the game. Engaging it as a boss is totally optional, though also optimal if you want to have the best chance of later defeating King Vendrick. As enormous and truly awesome as the Ancient Dragon looks, fighting it is a whole other matter, because this might be the single most boring boss in all of Soulsborne. Just as I earlier criticised the Armour Spider for having rather bland and transparent AI, the same is true for the Ancient Dragon, except here it has way more health to whittle down, and one small mistake can easily mean death, forcing you to start over. Despite its vast size, you don't really feel like you're actually contending with it, because most of its body is out of reach. Rather, you hit its toes a few times, run off as it flies up for a large AoE fire breath attack, bait it into a forward fire breath attack, and then run in and attack the toes again and repeat until defeat. It doesn't make for an engaging boss encounter at all. It's a shame too, because it really is a sick looking boss, and the arena is incredible too, but sadly the fight as a whole really ain't up to much. At number 144 we have the Leechmonger, the writhing monstrosity which concludes the damp misery of the Valley of Defilement's opening level, and a monster which is the spitting image of the Ouroboros Makono boss from Resident Evil 5, which actually only came out a month after Demon's Souls in Japan. Yet again, I think the biggest failing with this boss is the AI, and that's not the last time I'll be saying that for a Demon's Souls boss either. I've never died to the Leechmonger, and nor have I ever came remotely close to dying, because it's just too damn easy, and I think this clip of me fighting it perfectly illustrates this. I really didn't feel like I was in much danger here, so not very engaging, is it? If you do get hit by one of its attacks, your health will drain for a short amount of time, but not enough for it to cause any real concern, and the boss can also regenerate its health a bit as if it's just popped a life gem or something, but again, it's all just a bit too weak, not meaningfully adding to the challenge. The arena is very cool and rather unique, and the boss looks pretty cool, and to be honest, after the treacherous tribulations of the level which preceded it, it is kinda nice to fight something so straightforward, but all in all, the Leechmonger just isn't all that impressive as a boss. Funnily enough, my next pick happens to be a boss from the very next level of the game, found at the end of the Swamp of Sorrow. It's the Dirty Colossus. Again, the level leading up to it is a grueling grind of swamps and shit, with intimidating enemies and confusing level design, but again, the actual boss of the level really isn't particularly difficult. Its melee attacks are very easy to dodge, it has virtually no ability to chase you down once you're out of range, and it really doesn't have very much health when compared to the difficulty of the level leading up to it. Some folks praise Demon Souls bosses for being more akin to puzzles, but it's more about figuring them out, then going in for the kill, rather than the intense exchanges found in Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, and that is somewhat true, but for a boss like the Dirty Colossus, there's really nothing to figure out. You just run up and hit it a bunch, and indeed the sheer lack of challenge here is why I've placed it so low on the list, because it's a cool enough counter in all other regards, it just feels a bit weak and impotent, for lack of a better word. At number 142 we have the Executioner's Chariot, found in an optional section of Huntsman's Copse guarding the way to the Brotherhood of Blood Covenant. I guess this is something of a gimmick fight, because for the first phase you don't actually fight it head on at all. I mean, you could try, but good luck. Rather, the strategy is to move further around the arena, avoiding the damaging spokes of the chariot by diving into the alcoves along the way before pulling the lever at the end to lower the gate, dismantling the chariot from the two-headed dark horse which gives it motion, after which it can be fought conventionally. Honestly, it's a really cool idea for a boss, and very unique. However, as cool as the idea is, the execution of it is a bit bloody frustrating. Being cornered in pretty much any Soulsborne game tends to be a death sentence, and the same is absolutely true in Dark Souls 2, and that aspect contributes to why I don't like this encounter, because the many skeletons throughout the circular arena will frequently box you in whilst you're sheltering from the damaging chariot, or even prevent you from reaching the safe spots entirely, and it can just be really frustrating. One cool kind of hidden trick though is to simply dodge roll through the chariot as it comes round, though I guess this can be easier said than done if your adaptability isn't up to scratch, everyone's favourite stat. Also, with Dark Souls 2 being the undisputed king of horrible boss runbacks, of course the runback to the Executioner's Chariot is appropriately horrible, making each frustrating death all the more aggravating. Now we have a boss which I know ranks as the worst in Dark Souls 3 for many people, and I do get why. But it's one I've never been able to fully scorn, despite common opinion. It's the Curse-Rotted Greatwood. You see, I don't judge bosses purely on mechanics, cause come on, we all know there's more to Soulsborne bosses than their hitbox and moveset. There's the associated lore, the scale, the sound design, the sheer awesome factor of it, and it's that awesome factor that has always left me with a soft spot for the Curse-Rotted Greatwood, cause holy fuck, this is one awesome looking boss. Actually fighting it, however, isn't quite so awesome. I guess one of the most annoying aspects of it is that it's really difficult to get close to it for very long due to the size of both it and its attack hitboxes. Still, the first phase is easy enough as it takes huge damage from the weird gross sacs along its body and limbs, but it's the second phase where things get substantially more awkward, because now it's the pale spindly arm that has to be hit to deal any actual damage, and it just feels way harder than it should. It's always moving, it's always attacking, and even when you can get in for a hit or two, it never feels that satisfying because you just need to pull straight out again. That's what she said. Magic and consumables can certainly help, but even then it's hard to actually connect with the arm itself due to how thin it is. Nonetheless, I consider the Curse-Rotted Greatwood to be one of the most incredible looking Soulsborne bosses, and if the mechanics were better tuned, I assure you it would be significantly higher on the list, but then by that same token, if the visuals weren't so excellent, it would probably be a good bit lower. At number 140, we have Old King Allant. Honestly, bosses like this can be kinda difficult to rank because, okay, what was the developer's intention here? Was it to make a challenging, fast-paced encounter? No, obviously not. It was to make a dramatic one, filled with mixed emotions and even confusion by the player, and in that sense, this boss is a complete success, and I don't think it's bad at all. Nonetheless, if we were to dispense with all the romantic notions of what the developers intended and whatnot, and instead judge the boss purely based on how good the fight is, well, I guess I'd put it right here at number 140, though not with any enthusiasm. it's just a bit of a difficult one to place, to the point where if someone had it significantly higher on their own list because of Old King Alant's significance to the game's story, I'd get it. Once again, we're back to Dark Souls 2, and I'm afraid there's going to be plenty more appearing down here in the lower section of the list too. Though to any Dark Souls 2 fans watching, do not despair, because I think it has some awesome bosses too, who will appear very high in the rankings. Sadly though, Nashandra is not one of those bosses. Nashandra was of course the original final boss in the game before the update which added in Aldia, who, as I've discussed, ended up being even worse. I'll say up front that I do really like her design. It's very HR Giger in style, and I also find her entrance here to be very creepy, but sadly, that's about where my praise ends. It's not that the fight sucks, it's just that it's very, very underwhelming. Nashandra doesn't have that many attacks, she moves kinda slowly, and she's way too easy for a final boss, a far cry from the likes of Gwyn, Soul of Cinder or Gehrman. She always initiates the fight by placing 3 curse orbs around the arena too, which gradually fill your curse meter, and I've always found this attack to be both lame and weak. The curse status effect got a significant nerf in Dark Souls 2 compared to how it was in the first game, to the point where all it does here is lower your max HP a bit, easily cured with a human effigy, and the method of getting rid of these curse orbs is equally as lame. Couldn't they at least have added in a sound effect, or particle effect, or something here? It just feels and looks like you're hitting the air. If Nashandra appeared as a regular boss earlier on in the game, I'd probably have rated her a fair bit higher, because it's not that she's bad, it's that she was never good enough to be a final boss. At number 138 we have Lod and Zalin, the twin tigers found at the end of the Frigid Outskirts, aka one of, if not the single worst level in all of Soulsborne. You see, if I was to judge Lod and Zalin purely on their own merits as a boss, they might have rated a bit higher. However, when you take into account that it's just a doubled up repeat of an earlier boss, and when you consider the sheer frigid fucking hell of the level leading up to it, well, by the time I make it to the damn fog gate, I'm already in a pissy mood. And if I die to the boss, then that puts me in an even worse mood. Cause 1, I don't much like to get ganked by a boss, we've been through that already, and 2, I don't like shitty boss run bucks, and this one is about as shitty as they come. I'm not entirely sure how fair it is to judge a boss on the area leading up to it, and in an ideal world I wouldn't, but I just can't disregard it here. It's too significant and detrimental to the experience, to the point where when you say the words Lod and Zalin to a lot of Dark Souls 2 fans, they immediately think, oh god, the Frigid Outskirts, that place sucks. The level is intrinsically tied to the boss, and I'm afraid I don't like either of them. For as tough as the Asylum Demon and Taurus Demon surely were for brand spanking new players of Dark Souls, the real difficulty spike did not arrive until the fight with the gargoyles on the rooftops of the Undead Parish, and as a result, that particular boss encounter has a lot of notoriety amongst Souls fans, not because it's really super difficult, but because it's where the game requires a sudden elevation in what it demands from the player. And then they went and repeated the gargoyle fight in Dark Souls 2, except they made it less iconic and more kinda shit. It is an entirely optional fight of course, as are many bosses in Dark Souls 2, being found in a hidden area of the Lost Bastille, but I just don't like the way the boss was executed. Rather than there being one gargoyle and then another which joins after enough damage has been dealt to the first, here you have 2 which immediately spring into action and then more progressively join the fight as more damage is dealt to the shared health pool, to the point where you can have a whole bunch of gargoyles on screen at the one time, encouraging you to focus on defeating one before moving on to another, rather than just spreading the damage out. Things can get very hectic very quickly, and although it is just about manageable, it gets really annoying trying to focus on one of them whilst being attacked by several others, often forcing you to run around the rooftops to try and isolate one for just long enough to fully deplete its individual health bar before moving on to another. I guess the actual boss mechanics are solid enough, but I just don't like fighting multiple enemies at a time in Dark Souls 2. It never feels smooth, and this boss is all about fighting multiple enemies at once. Now we're getting more into the region of the list where the bosses are a bit more on the lame or underwhelming side rather than being bad or truly flawed. And I think a perfect example of a lame boss is Scorpioness Nashka, who guards the way to the doors of Pharos from the Shaded Woods. I'm sure nearly everyone who saw Nazca for the first time probably thought much the same thing. Probably something along the lines of, ah, so it's like Quelag but as a scorpion. Some folk might even like the idea and design, but personally it does nothing for me, and when compared to Quelag, Nazca has significantly less presence and power. I guess the opening of the fight is kinda cool, the way how at first it just looks like a woman who's stuck in the sand before revealing that no, oh actually it's a massive scorpion thing. She uses a mixture of soul magic and melee swipes from her enormous stingers, which all feel kinda standard, though a nice touch is that you can actually knock her stingers off if you continuously target them. Her dumbest attack though is where she digs down into the sand, then chases you before emerging up for an attack, because turns out this could happen. She was underground for a full 23 seconds there before coming back up. What the hell was she doing down there? I'm afraid Dark Souls 2 is on a roll here, ladies and gentlemen. Well, mostly gentlemen. At number 135, we have the rotund rascal itself, the covetous demon found in Earthen Peak. Honestly, if you were to ask me the single most defining feature of the covetous demon, I wouldn't talk about its size or the rather interesting mechanic where you can shoot down corpses from above to distract the boss for a bit. Instead, I would talk about how damn easy it is. There's just no challenge to this encounter whatsoever. Its attacks are very slow and well telegraphed. It doesn't have all that much health and won't do too much to defend itself even as you have at it, and the whole corpse mechanic just isn't even remotely necessary for victory, though I do like that it's there. Despite the utter lack of challenge here, I do actually enjoy fighting the covetous demon. There's nothing unpleasant or obnoxious about this encounter, and there's something pretty fun about just hitting it a bunch and watching its health bar go down in a very simple way. But overall, it's just a low effort boss. Plus, FromSoft brought it back as a mini boss type enemy in the Crown of the Ivory King DLC, except whiter. I remember back on my first playthrough of Dark Souls 1, on my first explorations of Darkroot Forest, finding myself truly enchanted by its atmosphere and ambience, and the strange inhabitants wandering around its expanse, like the mushrooms, the bush things, and the stone guardians. But it wasn't until I nervously stepped through the high up fog wall that I became truly enchanted, both with the level and with Dark Souls as a whole, as that beautiful, serene music began to play, followed by the soft, glimmering descent of the moonlight butterfly. It really is a beautiful boss experience, but that beauty doesn't quite extend to the actual mechanics of the fight. If you're a magic focused player, I guess you're going to have a more than easy time here, but if you're more melee oriented, then most of the fight consists of just trying to avoid its powerful magic attacks, either blocking it with a shield with decent magic defense like the Crest Shield, or simply rolling through the projectiles before the butterfly gracefully perches on the ledge for a nibble of a sweet mossy treat before I hack it to death with my great scythe. Take that, you dumb butterfly. As boring as the fight can be mechanically, the mechanics are still solid enough, and the whole Moonlight Butterfly experience ultimately is a pleasant one. Let's stick with Dark Souls 1 for another entry, shall we? Introducing the boss of the Catacombs, Pinwheel. Now, Pinwheel does have the reputation of being one of the all-time easiest Soulsborne bosses, though a significant reason for this is that most folk take him on quite late. Of course, you can access the catacombs extremely early, even before venturing into the Undead Burg. Pinwheel can be your second boss if that's what your heart truly desires, but generally that is not advisable, because the catacombs is a difficult area at the best of times, and especially difficult for a low level character, which makes the easiness of the level's boss a bit confusing. As such, on my most recent playthrough of Dark Souls, I decided to take on Pinwheel a bit earlier than normal, not before going to the Undead Parish, but before venturing down into the depths and Blighttown, and turns out it's still a really easy boss. The only real difference was that it took a wee bit longer to kill than normal, but other than that it's the same old Pinwheel we all know and love. I am on record as not being the biggest fan of Dark Souls 2's Brightstone Cove Seldora level at all. I think it's bland to look at and even blander to play through, and nor do I enjoy its enemies or level design, and I'm also not a big fan of the level boss, the Duke's dear Freya, the enormous two-headed spider that possesses one of the great souls required to gain passage through the Shrine of Winter. The main feature of this boss is its two heads, those being the only parts of its vast body which are vulnerable to damage, though a nice touch is that one head will literally fall off after enough damage has been dealt, forcing you to go around and attack the other end. You can sort of see it here, although the head ended up bugging out a bit. Ha, get it? Bugging? Because it's a spider? Oh, fuck off. I guess my main point of disdain for this fight is all the smaller spiders thrown into the mix. Freya herself isn't super difficult on her own, and so to up the challenge a bit, all these smaller enemies have also been added in, whereas I would have preferred the boss itself be more challenging. Also, if you happen to summon in one of the nearby NPC phantoms for the fight, like Manhunter O'Hara here, what a dumb name, then it pretty much breaks the boss and renders it semi-harmless, because both heads can't attack at the same time. It's an okay boss, certainly not among the worst that Dark Souls 2 has to offer, but nor is it among the best. I'll be honest, I'm already sick to death of talking about Dark Souls 2's bosses, and I haven't even gotten onto anything from Bloodborne or Elden Ring yet, but alas, another Dark Souls 2 challenger joins the fray. It's Mytha, Baneful Queen, found at the end of Earthen Peak, guarding the entrance to the Iron Keep. One thing I really appreciate with Dark Souls 2's bosses is how often it introduces external factors which can be activated or manipulated to affect conditions inside the actual boss arena. This isn't something the other games do much at all, yet it happens a ton in this game, and it's really cool and creative. However, the specific method of lowering the difficulty for the Mytha fight is a wee bit too obtuse for my liking, requiring you to set this particular windmill alight with a torch so as to somewhat drain the pool of poison inside the arena. Bit weird. Once inside though, we're faced with the headless Serpentine Queen herself, who uses a mixture of spear attacks, tail sweeps and soul magic. She also has a really cool attack where she throws her head at you, which then explodes for a magic AoE attack, but me and Jester Thomas here nailed her before she could use it. I kinda feel the same way towards Mytha as I do towards Scorpioness Nazca. She's just a very standard boss, and even their actual movesets are rather similar, except Mytha is part serpent instead of part scorpion. The poison element of the arena is quite a nice touch though, and even if you lower the poison pool, she can still regen her health a bit by lurking in the perimeter, and small touches like this are why I put Mytha a bit ahead of Nazca. And finally, I have graced this list with an appearance of a boss from my favourite Soulsborne game, Bloodborne, and the boss I have chosen is Mikolash, host of the Nightmare. If I was taking the Chalice dungeon bosses into account, a Bloodborne enemy would have been included earlier on this list, trust me, but as I've said, I am not taking them into account, and so yes, it has taken until number 130 before something from the game has finally appeared. I really don't think any of Bloodborne's bosses are bad, but there are a few underwhelming ones, and I do think Mikolash is one of them, which is a shame, because it could have been incredible, because parts of the encounter are incredible. The music and atmosphere are superb, perfectly complementing the labyrinthine nature of the halls of the Nightmare, all the while Mikolash rants, raves and mocks your hunter as you desperately try to chase him down. If you don't understand the gimmick of having to lure him into specific sections of the level, then it can be very frustrating when you can just never seem to catch him, but once you do back him into a corner, the actual fight begins, and unfortunately, this is where the experience kinda breaks down. Mikolash has no unique attacks of his own, but rather he'll only use basic unarmed punches, spam the Augur of Ebritus, or as can be particularly problematic, he'll use a Call Beyond in Phase 2 which has the potential to easily one-shot you. It's really odd that FromSoft did this, because it both could and should have been so much more. I mean, we're fighting him in a nightmare for God's sake, there are terrors and horrors everywhere, and then you encounter Mikolash and it's just some nerd with a dumb cage on his head. Even so, the other elements of this boss fight do elevate the experience by a fairly significant degree, hence why Mikolash did not appear earlier on this list. Aha, back to Dark Souls 3. Coming in at number 129 we have the Ancient Wyvern. This is another boss I actually found a bit difficult to place because it's highly unconventional. Despite what you may assume upon seeing the enormous grey wyvern drop down into the huge arena, you're not supposed to attack it directly, with it acting more like a dynamic environmental hazard. The real task is to simply move on through the level, past the serpents both small and large, taking care not to get roasted to death on the way by the stalking draconic menace below before situating yourself above its scaly head to drop down for a plunge attack and killing it in one devastating hit, dealing excess of 7,500 points of damage. So, you might be wondering why the hell I don't have the Ancient Wyvern down as the worst boss in Dark Souls 3, behind even Half-Light and the Cursed-Rotted Greatwood, and that's simply because I really enjoy moving through this boss arena. I like the idea of this stalking, nearly invulnerable boss trying to kill you as you move along the upper sections to position yourself for the killing blow. Now, I must take care not to glamorise the whole affair too much, because I'm not saying it's superbly executed, or that the Wyvern's AI doesn't leave something to be desired, but I don't have an inherent problem with gimmick fights, as long as the gimmick is fun and or cool, and I do think the whole plunge attack thing is very cool, unless you miss the head and fall to your death. That can happen. We already looked at one of the 4 significant initial bosses from Dark Souls 2 with the Duke Freya, who possesses one of the Great Souls, and for number 128 we have another, the Old Iron King, the final boss of the Iron Keep. Now, I do like nice big chunky monsters whose vast pools of health I can whittle down, and I guess as far as that goes, the Old Iron King has got me covered, but mechanically it leaves a lot to be desired. For a start, for as large and intimidating as it looks, the design is a bit generic, and furthermore, perhaps most of the challenge of the fight comes more from the surrounding magma than actual damage from the boss's attacks. In fact, the possibility of one of its attacks pushing you into said magma is of much more concern than the damage they do, especially that treacherous little patch of lava around the corner from the exit fog wall. Also, why does the boss just stay still and hold position after each one of its attacks? I mean, the answer's obvious, it's to give the player a chance to deal damage, but logically, why would it do that? It makes no sense. Or maybe I shouldn't be questioning the in-game logic of a massive magma monster, maybe that's dumb. Despite these gripes, I do still enjoy fighting the Old Iron King, more so than the Duke's Freya, though I sometimes wonder the extent to which the soul and boss soul reward for beating each Dark Souls 2 boss plays into my enjoyment of fighting them, because this game really is generous with the rewards, and there's a certain amount of base satisfaction that I get from seeing my soul counter double. Anyway, I'm rambling now, so let's swiftly move on to the next entry. Hemwick Charnel Lane is an awesome area, and without a doubt one of the most atmospheric levels in all of Soulsborne, a smoky, ashy expanse of gravestones and horror, complete with trolls, shrieking women and roaming executioners. Sadly, however, the level boss doesn't quite live up to the distinctive brilliance of the level itself, introducing the Witches of Hemwick. Like I said before, I don't consider any of Bloodborne's bosses to be bad, but the Witches of Hemwick are without a doubt one of the weaker ones. The thing is that the enemies you fight here are simply regular enemies you've already fought earlier or elsewhere, though if you come into the fight having spent away all your insight beforehand, then these shadowy creatures won't appear at all, trivialising the whole encounter. It's just a fight against these 2 hag type enemies who you may have already seen in Yahar Ghul, except here they're partially invisible, and that's about where it runs out of interesting features. Really not got all that much to say about the Witches of Hemwick, to be honest. It's kind of unremarkable, though it's more of an okay, gotta fight this boss now kind of deal than a god, gotta fight this boss now situation. Here we have another Bloodborne entry to the list, 2 in a row, and it's the optional fight with the Celestial Emissary at the end of Upper Cathedral Ward, who prevents passage on towards the Altar of Despair where Ebritus awaits. I mean, I'll make no bones about it, this is a gank fight. A gank fight with a large gang of these bizarre alien boys who, despite looking rather foolish with their wobbly blue heads, can hit surprisingly hard, though that's especially true of the main one responsible for the actual boss health bar, who balloons up to several times its original size in Phase 2. Look, I know this fight sucks. I know you're just fighting some regular enemies with a boss health bar, and I know it's essentially a more cosmic version of the Royal Rat Vanguard boss from Dark Souls 2, but nonetheless, I like it. I love popping a bolt paper and a beast blood pellet and then going to town on a big crowd of these things with my beast cutter and watching that health bar disappear. It's just really satisfying and fun, and so despite how mechanically and conceptually superior many previous bosses may be in comparison to it, I'm putting it at number 126. Sue me. That was a joke, please do not take legal action against the channel. Well, I just can't get enough of Dark Souls 2 now, can I? Here at number 125 we have the Guardian Dragon found at the end of Aldea's Keep, guarding the way to the elevator which takes the player all the way up to the Dragon Eyrie, which I think is one of the best looking levels in the game. The thing about the Guardian Dragon is that it's very inoffensive. I wasn't offended by the fight at all. It's about as standard as a dragon fight can be with all the classic attacks ranging from the Stomp, the Bite, the Fire Breath, and my personal favourite, the Fireball. Magic or miracle users will have a very easy time with it, especially if you throw out some lightning spears, though the fact that it likes to fly around a lot can make a melee focused approach a bit awkward to implement, though that is a common complaint with dragon bosses in general. I've never really found the Guardian Dragon to be very difficult to beat. Really, it's just another decent enemy with a boss health bar, and it's fine by me, though you do go on to fight what are essentially clones of it in the following level. Once again we return to Demon Souls, and again to the Tower of Latria, except my pick for number 124 is the boss for the world's first level, Prison of Hope. It's the Fool's Idol. I have memories from the first couple of times I played Demon Souls, back in the PS3 days, of running up to the Fool's Idol and destroying her health bar before she had much of a chance to do anything, which is why it surprised me so much when I took her on again years later on the PS5 version and actually had a pretty hard time. The main point of pain for me isn't just the fact that she creates clones of herself everywhere, it's those damaging green traps on the ground which would catch me out as I'm making my way to her clones to determine which is the real boss. To tell you the truth, I found this extremely irritating and frustrating, but then I realised that you can tell which is the true Fool's Idol by targeting each one. If it's a clone, it'll have its own smaller health bar, whereas the real idol will not. I guess this goes back to the whole puzzle element of Demon Souls bosses that people talk about. I think it's done really well here because of its unusual subtlety. Well, we've seen this kitty cat before, haven't we? Or at least two like it back in the Lud and Zalin fight that I put at number 138. But I've put Ava a good deal higher because 1, it really is a decent boss at its core, and 2, there's no excruciating run back, and 3, you fight Ava before fighting Lud and Zalin. It is the first of its kind, and that does count for something. Yet again, and not for the last time in Dark Souls 2, we have a case where the difficulty of the boss can be lowered by actions taken outside of the actual boss arena, though that difficulty is substantially lowered in this case, rendering Ava fully visible after collecting the Eye of the Priestess further on in the level. It is entirely possible to defeat the boss whilst it's invisible via careful observation of its particle effects and by its sound cues, but unless you're a very skilled speedrunner, I wouldn't really advise that strategy. There's no special reward for beating it that way. I remember back when Dark Souls 2 first came out, when a lot of folk were complaining that too many of the bosses were just dudes, and ladies, in armour, which I guess they found bland compared to the variety of outlandish demons found in Dark Souls 1. I mean, personally, I like fighting knights of all varieties in these games, as well as monsters, and so this was never really a complaint of mine, but nonetheless, I also enjoy fighting monsters, and I especially like the idea of fighting an enormous white tiger, and that idea was executed well with the Ava encounter, with its leaps, swipes, and even magic. In my opinion, Bloodborne's one and only DLC, The Old Hunters, is the single greatest DLC of any game. I already adore almost everything about Bloodborne's base game, but then The Old Hunters came along and straight up surpassed it with its even more visceral horror, incredible level design, and legendary bosses. But speaking of its bosses, there is one encounter in particular which doesn't really come close to matching the quality of the others, and that boss is the Living Failures. This is another one of the fights against a set of identical enemies who will continuously spawn until their shared health pool has been fully depleted, just like the Four Kings, though with a markedly less impressive moveset, mainly consisting of wild swings and brainless head bashes, complete with arcane homing projectiles of course. Despite all this, there are a couple of things I like very much about this encounter. For one, the arena looks incredible. The way this enormous sunflower shifts in the wind throughout the fight is awesome, but more to the mechanics side of things, the Living Failures have one of the coolest ever Soulsborne attacks in their arsenal with their cosmic meteor shower. For as in your face as much of the horror of Bloodborne is, it absolutely gets into the realm of cosmic horror, and I think these astral elements are especially interesting and compelling, and so when the skybox turns all galactic here for their meteor attack, it gets me every damn time and elevates the living failures from a rather bland gank fight into something just that bit greater. Eudex Gundyr is the very first boss of Dark Souls 3, initially appearing as a static statue towards the end of the Cemetery of Ash, leading up to Firelink Shrine. See, I do enjoy the Gundyr fight, however I don't think it's great as a first boss, specifically because of its second phase. It's all great at first with a conventional but still cool array of moves from Glaive and Fist, but then he whips out the Pus of Man party trick and things break down a bit. I've beaten Dark Souls 3 umpteen times at this point, including at level 1, but Gundyr's second phase can still get me sometimes because it can be so difficult to interpret his animations here, and I don't think that's a great quality for the game's first boss, especially when so many of the game's other bosses feel so tight and polished in comparison. I do think Eudex Gundyr is a fun fight, but if I had my way, I think it would have been better if he just stayed in his first phase throughout the whole fight, then maybe you can encounter a Pus of Man enemy just outside, just like you do a bit later in the High Wall of Lothric. Not only did Dark Souls 2 bring back an altered version of the Gargoyle boss fight, but it also brought back Uncle Ornstein, or at least some dude wearing his armour and wielding his weapon. I'll be honest, I know and understand very little about Dark Souls 2's lore, and so I've got no idea why this guy is even here, but nonetheless, I like this fight. It's certainly not even half as challenging as the original Ornstein and Smo fight from the first game, but even so, the old Dragon Slayer has an enjoyable and somewhat rhythmic moveset, which makes for a great early game boss, though it is also optional, just like the Dragon Rider found at the opposite end of Hyde's Tower of Flame. I happen to love the Tower of Flame level, and one of the reasons for that really is that I get to fight the old Dragon Slayer, though for whatever reason, the Scholar of the First Sin version went and made all that a great deal more awkward. Fun fight though, and I think it's a really cool touch that he still uses his butt slam, except now it does dark damage instead of lightning. Just a cool wee elemental tweak they added there. The Crucifixion Woods really isn't my favourite Dark Souls 3 level. It is cool in several ways, but there's something about its layout that doesn't quite gel with me. I think it's the excessive number of enemies littered everywhere. I prefer fewer strong enemies than a greater number of weaker ones. It just makes dispatching them feel more gratifying. Enough rambling about the level itself though, because this is about the boss of the Crucifixion Woods, the Crystal Sage with its big floppy hat. This is another clone type boss, and is actually rather similar to the Fool's Idol now that I think about it, at least in terms of mechanics, if not appearance. It's the kind of boss where two people can have drastically different experiences too, in terms of difficulty, and I myself have had varying experiences here on different playthroughs. If you're too lax in taking care of the clones, or you're dilly-dallying in dealing enough damage to the true Crystal Sage, who can be identified by the purple colour of its crystal ball, then the fight can quickly devolve into a chaotic mess of crystal projectiles flying every which way, resulting in a frustrating and overwhelming boss experience. But even so, this is a solid fight with a solid visual design and solid mechanics. It's solid enough. You do fight a more difficult version of it too later on in the Grand Archives, which is way more of a headache than this encounter. One of the all-time greatest Soulsborne boss moments occurs in the Osiris boss fight, once around 40% of its HP has been depleted, whereupon the Consumed King takes his invisible child and violently smashes it into the ground, and that's the kind of thing I like to see. I know that sounds weird, but what I mean is that I like the edge of these games, the grit, the horror and brutality, and even if the baby in question here is invisible, that is pretty damn brutal. The first phase and second really are completely different though. In fact, it's kinda like the opposite of the Ludwig fight, who starts off all wild and bestial before regaining his intelligence and composure, whereas here, Osiris starts off using speech, standing on his hind legs, and even casting magic before going apeshit in the second half of the fight. He does have some rather bullshit attacks in that second half though, which is quite unfortunate. In particular, the near instant charge attack is unreasonably difficult to react to. I do like the idea of him totally losing his shit like this, but the actual execution of it mechanically could have been better. It's one of those bosses that feels more difficult than it should. I still like it though, and Osiris as a character is really cool and disturbing, especially with his weird pale appearance and that he doesn't seem to have any actual eyes. Whereas Osiris was something of a perversion of the form of a dragon, I guess you can say much the same about the Gaping Dragon from Dark Souls 1, except this thing is anomalous in a different way. When it comes down to it, the Gaping Dragon is neither a difficult or technical boss, but nonetheless I remember having a very tough time with it on my first journey through the game, though at the same time I had a very poor understanding of the game's mechanics. In fact, I didn't even understand that invincibility frames were a thing until my second playthrough. I know it seems obvious now, but there's nothing in the game that suggests you can simply roll through attacks, and I'd never seen anything like that in other games either, and so I used an awful lot of shields in the early days. Being a sewer beast of such prodigious size, the Gaping Dragon is distinctly slow and lumbering with much of its attack animations, like its forward crawl, though you do have to watch out for that one because it removes about half your health if you get remotely near it, even from the back. Even so, this thing has some surprising acrobatic skills which require swift repositioning lest you get flattened by its vast form and then swallowed into that gaping hole. I remember playing this game with a buddy a good few years ago, and upon seeing this boss emerge up from the other end of the arena, he said something along the lines of, "That looks dumb, I don't like that boss design." Well, I do like this boss design, and I also love that you can cut its tail off for the Dragon King Great Axe, though I've never properly used that weapon now that I think about it, probably due to its strength requirement of 50. Speaking of having a poor understanding of the game's mechanics, I also didn't understand that equip load was a thing either in the early days, so I remember equipping the outrageously heavy Dragon King Great Axe and not even being able to roll due to being overburdened, but I just thought that's what happened when you equipped a heavy weapon or armour. Such ignorance. But then that process of slowly gaining an understanding of how the world and mechanics actually worked played a big part in making those early playthroughs so damn special. Sitting rather comfortably at number 116 I have the Taurus Demon, which for most people is the second boss they face in Dark Souls after that initial gauntlet through the Undead Burg, perhaps after a tense encounter with a Black Knight. If I were to judge the Taurus Demon solely as an enemy, I probably wouldn't have placed it higher than so many others. I mean, you end up fighting a multitude of them later on in the Demon Ruins, just like the Capra Demon. However, this boss battle just has too much cultural significance. Maybe cultural isn't the right word there, but everyone remembers the panic in their hearts once this thing jumps down from the tower and how your immediate reaction is to panic and run the fuck away. Then there's the two holes shooting down at you from the tower to your rear, which might just give you the idea to go for a plunge attack, because God knows when you're a rank amateur.
Rank amateurs!
At Dark Souls, you need all the tricks and fine cheeses available to you. Like I said, the enemy on its own isn't tremendously interesting, but the arena and even its placement as an early game boss are solid, and speaking of the arena, I don't believe there's ever been another one quite like it anywhere else in Soulsborne. Well, here's another one that might surprise people a bit, but I really like the first boss of Dark Souls 2, the Last Giant, found in the depths of the Forest of Fallen Giants, which makes a lot of sense actually. See, it's really not a technical boss at all, to the point where all of its attacks are easy to read and easy enough to dodge, but even so, I love the design and its moveset is just pleasant for me to work with. The Last Giant certainly doesn't make for a challenging first boss, certainly not like Udex Gundyr, but you can still die to it, and again I don't quite love the idea of a very challenging first boss anyway, unless it's one you're supposed to die to like Genichiro or the Grafted Scion. By the way, one of my favourite Soulsborne tropes is when things rip their own arm off and or use that arm as a weapon, and it's so sick when the Last Giant does this for extra range. But was it really worth ripping your own arm out of its socket for a range buff? Just a really cool, simple boss, and I also love the implication that this is actually the Shattered Giant Lord who fell below after being defeated in the battle for Drang Lake when the Giants invaded the land. Coming up next is Seath the Scaleless, a holder of one of the 4 Lord Souls in Dark Souls 1 who resides in the Duke's archives before making a frantic entrance into the Crystal Caves as the player approaches its Crystal of Immortality. The Crystal Caves is one of those levels that looks strikingly beautiful, but that I don't really enjoy playing through very much, and I kinda have the same opinion when it comes to Seath itself. This is one of the coolest looking bosses in all of Soulsborne. I love how huge, pale and crystalline it is. However, the act of actually fighting it has always felt a wee bit awkward, with how its weird legs can block your movement, or how annoying it is to avoid damage when they start thrashing around, and how bloody common it is to get stuck in there with a clam when you first enter. Nonetheless, this really is a spectacular fight, and the Crystal of Immortality aspect is a really nice touch. I like waiting right by it while Seath slowly slithers over, and then fucking rolling right through it. Take that. Also, this was still back in the days when you get awesome secret weapons from cutting off the tails of dragons, and Seath was no exception to that, getting you the legendary Moonlight Greatsword. I'll never understand why FromSoft stopped including that feature in later games. I mean, why wouldn't you keep that tradition up? It's so sick. Now, the next 4 entries in the list are all very similar to each other, and as such, I'm going to cover them collectively, because I really don't especially prefer one over the other due to them being based off of the original. It's Vanguard, the Asylum Demon, the Stray Demon, and the Demon Fire Sage. Like I said, the Vanguard was the first such enemy who came in this particular shape, and I guess the most defining feature of this boss is that classic butt slam, and thank God it has that butt slam, because it's by far the easiest of its attacks to avoid and counter. And they'd even go on to add a new iteration of the enemy in Elden Ring too, with the Erdtree avatar. Of these 4 iterations though, I guess the Vanguard is the most unique in that you're generally supposed to die to it on your first encounter, unless you're really good, whereas with the Asylum Demon, you're supposed to initially run away from it, and then with the Stray Demon and Demon Fire Sage, well, those are just straight fights, though you can fight the Vanguard as an optional enemy later on in the first level of the Shrine of Storms for its Demon Soul. A lot of people have an inherent dislike for reskinned bosses, but I really don't. As long as the boss fight is still good, and the Stray Demon and Demon Fire Sage fights which appear in the Undead Asylum and Demon Ruins respectively are decent enough fights, even though while the Stray Demon has a somewhat expanded moveset compared to the tutorial boss, the Demon Fire Sage seems to have the exact same moveset to the Stray Demon as far as I can tell, except with a fire effect added, and that's kind of a shame. These are all simple encounters, but they're encounters I've always enjoyed. Dark Souls 1 is really good at providing the player with these big, meaty bosses with chunky health bars to diminish, and indeed, who among you can resist the fat ass of the Asylum Demon? At number 109 we have the Deacons of the Deep, a straight up gank fight appearing at the end of the Cathedral of the Deep around Aldrich's vast coffin. I've shown some disrespect for a few gank fights earlier on in this list, and so some of you might be wondering why I've included one so much higher, and I guess the simple reason for it is that this one is just fun. In fact, the best thing about this boss is just how many deacons there actually are, because it gives you a great opportunity to pull out your most extravagant spells, pyromancies, miracles or sweeping melee attacks, and just going to town dealing some serious, satisfying damage. I guess the fight can get a wee bit chaotic, but not too chaotic, and almost never really frustrating, probably due to the low damage the enemies actually inflict. The feature of the red haze marker floating to the particular deacon who needs to be damaged to lower the boss health bar is really cool, and how this Pope dude appears around about halfway through. It's just an enjoyable fight with lots of damage and flashiness. And at number 108 we again have a boss from the Valley of Defilement, an archdemon in fact, and another tricky one to judge. It's Maiden Astraea. Maiden Astraea is very different from almost every other boss on this list, though I suppose she shares the most similarity with Old King Allant. The Maiden herself will never attack you, instead sending her champion Garl Vinland to defend her, and even he won't initially attack you unless you keep trying to get past him, though sadly the actual fight with Garl is neither challenging nor particularly well executed due to the fact that his weapon can bounce off the walls of the cave. Even so, this boss is not about challenge or complexity, it's about instilling mixed emotions in the player about whether or not they're the good guy in all this. Though personally, despite how nice Maiden Astraea looks and how goddamn incredible her soundtrack is, I don't think she's the good guy at all, regardless of her intentions. The Valley of Defilement is a miserable, rotten, plague-ridden hellhole. Surface level lore discussions aside though, this is an effective encounter. I don't know if I'd call it a good boss, and so I can't really justify putting it any higher on the list, but I think the developers achieved what they set out to do here, and Maiden Astraea no doubt makes for one of the most memorable bosses in all of Soulsborne. A lot of folk criticised Dark Souls 3's Ashes of Ariandel DLC for being a bit too short when it first came out, but personally I was always happy enough with the length, mainly because the content was so excellent, not to mention the stunning wintry visuals. Mind you, it is a fact there are only 2 bosses included in the DLC, the infamous Sister Frieda and the somewhat more forgettable Champagne's Gravetender and his loyal Great Wolf. At first, you don't quite know what you're getting into with the fight, because the only initial enemies are a pack of wolves, a common feature in the Painted World, but then the Champagne's Gravetender himself joins the fight, though he seems to have forgotten his trousers. What was he doing with these wolves? It is a fairly standard NPC type fight at first, though the Gravetender does have a unique weapon called the Lionheart, which he drops upon defeat, which might be the only single Dark Souls weapon that includes both a sword and a shield. The real enemy of interest here though is the Great Wolf, though this won't be the first time you'll have seen it. This thing makes an appearance earlier on in the level 2, though it can't be fully defeated in those encounters. I'll be honest, this boss fight is kinda forgettable, and it's not even required to be beaten to finish the DLC, but I do think the Great Wolf in particular makes for a really enjoyable fight and complements the Gravetender very well in comparison to the infuriating clusterfuck that is the Headless Apes. I'm sure everyone remembers that first time they used the key on the door to the Bergenworth Lunarium and stepped out, seeing the feeble form of Master Willem sat on his rocking chair, who is by this point unable to even speak, instead only moaning and pointing towards the moonlit lake with his staff. At first I thought, well, obviously I'm not supposed to jump down there, I'll die. But then I thought, I guess I am supposed to jump down there, and down I went, into one of the most striking Soulsborne boss arenas there ever was, though Elden Ring would later pay some tribute to it in phase 2 of the fight with Renala. Despite being called a spider, Rom sure does look pretty damn strange with its vast, shimmering body, not to mention the tiny legs it scuttles around on, though if you later visit the mysterious Altar of Despair you get a good indication of how Rom would have looked with her original legs. Like many interesting boss fights, there's something pretty unique about it, that being that Rom will not attack you in the first phase, just allowing you to pummel her with your chosen trick weapon, most effectively with the aid of a bolt paper and beast blood pellet, though after the vacuous spider teleports away, that's when she starts pulling out all the arcane attacks. The biggest threat to success in this encounter though is without a doubt the army of smaller spiders which spawn in great number anytime Rom teleports, to the point where there can be dozens of them in the arena at the one time. Rom can absolutely deal massive damage with her arcane attacks, and even when she simply thrashes around, but good god, the smaller ones hit so hard, you could even say they hit excessively hard, and you can't call yourself a Bloodborne veteran until you've been near one-shotted from one of these things dive-bombing you. Mind you, for as troublesome as this boss can be, the Chalice Dungeon version of Rom is so much worse, having more spiders, more health and a smaller arena. It's actually possible to take Rom out really quickly if you're efficient and accurate in your attacks, and if you're bold enough to ignore the spiders, but the safest way really is to painstakingly take out all her minions and then focus on her, and it can get tedious having to do this on every attempt. Even so, I do still enjoy the fight, particularly how unconventional it is, how gorgeous the arena is, and how significant Rom is to the story, to the extent where the game world undergoes a significant change once she's been defeated. Accessible by entering the memory of Jay in the Forest of Fallen Giants, which puts you right in the thick of the battle for Drangleic, stands the Giant Lord at the other end of the defences, tall, imposing and well armed and handsome. Now, I'll be the first to admit that this is one of those cases where my logic can break down a wee bit, because while this is absolutely a flawed fight, I still really like it. The camera stinks, so much so that you can only ever see about half of its body, and even once you get close to it, it'll mostly use stomps, not the most interesting attack from a boss like this, albeit with the occasional easily avoided sword swipe, and despite this being a very late game boss, it's damn easy, to the extent that it's great for farming souls if you've got some spare bonfire ascetics. Despite all this, I simply find the giant lord to be really enjoyable to fight, and the idea that you and it are doing battle in the middle of this much larger battle with so much chaos in the background is all really sick, and goes to show that tight mechanics and intense difficulty aren't everything when it comes to making a fun boss. Not sure I'd call this a great boss, but it is fun, and that's the most important thing. The Catacombs of Carthus isn't exactly my favourite level in Dark Souls 3, and as for the Demon Ruins which lies far below it, I have even less fondness. As for the area boss though, I think I have a greater opinion of it than many Dark Souls 3 players. You fight all sorts of skeletons throughout the Dark Souls games, but High Lord Wolnir has to be the largest and spookiest, even more so than those big fuckers from the Tomb of the Giants, but don't even talk to me about those bloody dogs, they've given me enough grief. Like a sizable portion of Soulsborne bosses, Wolnir is a gimmick fight. Rather than the strategy being to simply attack him head on, these three bright glowing bangles on his bony arms are the weak points, exploding in a satisfying flash of white light when destroyed and taking off a third of his health each time. I've said before, I am A-OK with gimmick fights as long as they're fun, and I've always found the Wolnir fight to be pretty damn fun, though I have gotten unlucky before where he spammed his forward charge attack to the point where I get overwhelmed by the purple bong smoke and die, and that sure ain't fun. But what can I say, I still like it enough. Mind you, I'd completely understand anyone who'd put Wolnir significantly lower, and I do agree that there was some missed potential to this fight. I think I would have preferred that they ditched the bangle gimmick, ditch the smaller skeletons that flood the arena, and make it more of a straight fight, but hey, this is what we got instead, and it's alright. The first Dark Souls game did only receive a single DLC, that being the much loved Artorias of the Abyss content pack, which arrived a bit over a year after the base game. Sure wish I could say the same for Shadow of the Erdtree, but alas, here we wait. Artorias of the Abyss introduced some sick bosses, but it all starts off with a very decent boss, the Sanctuary Guardian who guards the way to Ulusil's Sanctuary, hence the name Sanctuary Guardian. Got that? I have always liked the visual design of it, but at the same time it's always seemed a tad out of place to me. I mean, you never really encounter anything else in Dark Souls 1 that looks like this, though I guess you have travelled much further back in time here, which explains away that. It's a very fair boss with some cool attacks, both from flight and well grounded, and the lightning ranged attacks make use of that hidden effect in Dark Souls where they get extra damage and range if they hit water, a cool touch that's very easy to miss, which makes it even cooler in my book. And not only did FromSoft see fit to provide extra weapons as a reward for cutting off dragon tails, but they even did the same thing here with the Sanctuary Guardian for its guardian tail. Furthermore, if you come back to this arena later on, there are two Sanctuary Guardians here, though due to the lack of a boss health bar, it's not officially a part of this list. But nonetheless, that's a pretty intense challenge. In fact, despite how many times I've finished Dark Souls and its DLC, I don't think I've ever actually beaten these two, and nor am I likely to. Excluding the fight against the Vanguard in the tutorial which you're very likely to die on, the first genuine boss of Demon's Soul is against the Phalanx at the end of the first level of Boletaria, which happens to be my favourite world. As far as first bosses go, I think the Phalanx is excellent and a great conclusion to a great level. All through the gates of Boletaria, you'll be fighting lots of Dreglings, many of whom will drop firebombs and even turpentine, two consumables which are very useful throughout the level itself. However, it's when you get to the Phalanx that these things really come into play, and I always look forward to standing back and chucking a few firebombs at the slimy glowing core, and watching the splash damage being done to the lesser enemies surrounding it. I get a similar sort of kick from fighting the Phalanx as I do with the Deacons of the Deep. There's just a lot of enemies huddled tight around each other, and I'm going to see how many of them I can hit with a single attack. Phalanx really isn't difficult to figure out, and nor is it difficult to beat, but you can still die to it if you get careless, and these are attributes I really appreciate in an opening or early game boss. I mentioned before that one of the reasons I enjoyed Dark Souls 2's Tower of Flame level so much is that I get to fight the old Dragon Slayer, who I consider to be a straightforward and enjoyable boss, but I have very similar feelings towards the level's other boss, the Dragon Rider. This really is one of the easiest fights in the game, and that goes for both this version and the version later on in Drangleic Castle, where you fight two Dragon Riders, But low difficulty aside, I absolutely love fighting this enemy, and as silly as it might sound, its visual design plays a big part of that. The Dark Souls games feature a ton of awesome armour sets which are super detailed, remarkably well designed and memorable, with the Elite Knight set from Dark Souls 1 being a favourite of mine, and one that also makes an appearance in Dark Souls 2 and 3. Do you know what doesn't make an appearance in Dark Souls 3 though? The Dragon Rider set, or the Dragon Rider halberd, bow, twin blade or great shield, and that makes me sad because I think this is one of the sickest looking enemies in the trilogy. Yes, its moveset is very limited and basic, and yes, you do encounter it as a regular enemy later on in the game, but even so, I just love to fight it. Let's stick with the theme of very simple bosses for a second, shall we? And journey on to the end of the first level of the Shrine of Storms, past the skeletons, storm beasts and more skeletons, to the treacherous lair of the Adjudicator. See, whilst the Dragon Rider is very easy, having just a few basic halberd moves, the Adjudicator literally only has two possible attacks. A tongue attack it uses at long range, and a brutal chop attack it uses at close range. The issue is that these attacks ain't shit. It's so bafflingly easy to defeat this boss and just never take damage due to how limited its options are, to the point where I think it should have been given at least one more attack to sometimes throw out. Furthermore, sometimes it won't use any attacks at all, as can be seen here during my magic run where the boss's AI flat out broke. In spite of all these profoundly unimpressive attributes, the Adjudicator is still a sick boss with a sick arena. The design of it is crazy with that gaping bloody wound on its side, not to mention the whole having a bird for a head thing, though Bluepoint did change up its appearance a fair bit in the remake for whatever reason. Really don't know why they did that, and nor do I like what they did with the original Adjudicator theme, the one that sounds like this. If you play through Bloodborne paying little to no heed of the third umbilical cord items found in the optional areas, then the final boss of the game will be none other than Gehrman, the first hunter, or possibly even Mergo's wet nurse if you chose the easy way out with the game's final choice. However, providing you've consumed 3 third umbilical cords, the true final boss is revealed, coming down from on high. Moon Presence. My opinion of the Moon Presence has similarities to how I feel about Nishandra. It's a good boss, but not quite final boss material, and certainly not up to scratch when compared to Gehrman. Even so, I don't want to detract from it too much because I do enjoy it, and to be honest, after fighting Gehrman, something comparatively easier makes for a pretty nice change. While I don't find the Moon Presence terribly challenging, I do find it difficult to not get hit by it. I guess its animations can make it a bit hard to tell when it's attacking and when it isn't. It is one of the very few Soulsborne enemies with nearly unavoidable damage too, unless you kill it extremely fast I guess, though you can quickly get the health back from this particular attack by making use of Bloodborne's rally mechanic. You know, it's a shame that Bloodborne is stuck at 30 FPS, I know. However, I feel that people are still a bit too harsh on its visuals. Personally, I get used to the lower frame rate after about 10 minutes of any new playthrough, to where I stop even noticing it, and despite the game having came out back in 2015, it still looks fucking incredible. God damn, I love this game. I think the first boss that gave me trouble in Dark Souls 2 was the Pursuer, being a pretty big step up in challenge when compared to the last giant, which comes just a bit before it on the same level, but an even bigger step up in challenge arrived when I dropped down into the arena where the 3 Ruin Sentinels awaited me, because there's 3 of them and only 1 of me. Usually this would spark swift Scottish anger from me, prompting me to shoot thunderbolts from my arse, as Mel Gibson so finely put it, but in this case, I rather like it. You don't fight all 3 right off the bat, instead being stuck on a platform with just one of them, encouraging you to kill it before the others jump up here too, which they can. Then, after one's been defeated, now you've got just 2 left, and while it's still challenging for sure, it's also reasonable and doable with smart spacing tactics. I simply must mention the Ruin Sentinel's awesome boss theme too, the one that's playing now. For whatever reason, Dark Souls 2's soundtrack rarely gets any love, and I tend to disregard it myself quite often, but when I actually stop and listen to some of its tracks, a track like this, I'll usually find myself saying, hang on a minute, this song fucking slaps. The Dark Beast Parallel battle does something I always like to see in a Soulsborne game, where it lets you see the monster before the battle even initiates, making you wonder whether you should press on or turn back. It's one of the things I loved about Elden Ring's field bosses, the way you'd often see them roaming around, building the tension as you approach before the battle actually begins. Paro is a completely optional fight, and also slightly awkwardly placed. See, if you get kidnapped by one of these, what are they called? Oh. Then they drag you off to the Hypogean jail in Yahar'gul in a burlap sack, and from the lower levels you can encounter Dark Beast Paro, who explodes into thunderous action for a frantic and loud fight. But if you miss the Yahar'gul event, then you'll encounter Paro much later, when you're likely to be much more powerful and when you can make very short work of it, and not have to find out how much of a fucking pain in the arse it can be when you're trying to hit its thin yet somehow still hairy legs. Paro's AoE attack is the biggest nuisance here, though with proper timing it can be iframed through, but the true strategy is to make use of Bloodborne's stagger system, targeting specific limbs to keep it from fully powering up and becoming a real challenge. Super cool encounter, but fighting it early on can get quite frustrating, especially if you're using a weapon with poor range. It's one of the things that always kept me from being a big fan of the Deathbirds from Elden Ring 2, they're just kinda awkward to actually hit. We've already spoken about the Belfry Gargoyles, but that was specifically their somewhat shallow reappearance in Dark Souls 2, but here, a good bit higher on the list, we have the original encounter. The original fuck this moment for many first time Dark Souls players, myself included. That's not a joke, by the way. I literally sold the game after getting repeatedly hammered by these things and didn't play it for another year and a half or something, but I'm glad I did play it again, because I realised they weren't actually as hard as they first seemed. For a start, if you've introduced yourself to Solaire beforehand, which you absolutely should have, then he's available to be summoned, providing you haven't ran out of humanity, and providing you even understand what the hell humanity is/does on your first playthrough, which is not a given. Also, the gargoyles really aren't very tanky, same with most bosses from the first Dark Souls actually, and furthermore the second gargoyle's fire breath attack is actually really easy to punish. Despite all that, the encounter really can be a hotspot of frustration, especially considering the annoying run back and if you've used up all your humanity and gold pine resin already. Really sick boss and absolutely iconic, the perfect boss for the awesome level that is the Undead Parish. It's kind of a theme in Demon's Souls where the archdemons have some twist or gimmick or something which makes them irregular to actually fight, with the exception of False King Alant, which is just a straight up fight. The Storm King is no exception though, being one of the largest Soulsborne bosses and a solid gimmick fight. The first phase simply has you taking down the many smaller storm beasts hovering around in the sky, ideally with the nearby Storm Ruler sword, though magic or a bow also suffices. Once enough of them have been felled however, the Storm King makes its grand entrance, and it's all pretty fucking epic as you slice at the sky, dealing huge chunks of damage to its vast alien body each time. Mind you, as much as I enjoy hitting this thing, I don't so much enjoy the defensive aspect of it when it sends those weird projectiles at you. They're kinda encouraged to just hide behind this stone structure, but I don't really find this as engaging as it perhaps should have been. It's not a very fun sort of evasion. A lot of fans of the original Demon's Souls on PS3 rag on the remake for having diminished atmosphere and looking rather sterile in comparison, and I do agree with some of these arguments, but I also think the remake excels in other places, and a perfect example of that is the Storm King fight with the dramatic music and weather effects. If you're going to have a gimmick boss, best to try and make it as epic as possible. Well, that will conclude part 1 folks. We covered a pretty wide range there, from bosses that I detest to ones that I dislike a bit, to ones that I find kinda lame or underwhelming, to ones that I think are pretty decent, to ones that I think are great, to some that I even find rather excellent. This is Soulsborne we're talking about, mind you, so it's not like a third of the bosses on the entire list of 162 suck, and then the next third are good, and then the next third are awesome, but rather a small minority suck, and most from then on have at least one redeeming quality. I hope you'll check out parts 2 and 3, or you can just watch the entire 4.5 hour video that I put out earlier, if you can manage to sit through it for that long. Before I depart, I shall give a fond thank you to my kind patrons, and lastly, cheers for watching and cheerio.